Today is September the 19th. What does God look for? Let's find out together as we study 1 Samuel 16 to 18. So in our Bible reading today, 3 chapters from the book of 1 Samuel. The Lord has rejected Saul. Starting in chapter 16, you will have seen how the Lord calls Samuel to go to Bethlehem. There, he goes to Jesse's house and asks to see Jesse's sons. At first, Jesse introduces him to his sons in the traditional way, from oldest down to youngest, and he introduces all his sons, and the Lord says, no, it's not them. Samuel says, well, who else is there? And Jesse says, well, there's the runt of the litter. My youngest son is out tending the sheep. Call him. He comes, and the Lord says, this is the one. So Samuel anoints David. Now, at the end of chapter 16, David actually goes and he serves in Saul's court for a while. In 16:14, the Spirit of the Lord had left Saul, and the Lord sent a tormenting spirit that filled him with depression and fear. So Saul begins to suffer from depression, and one of the byproducts of this depression is that Saul has infrequent fits of rage, uncontrollable rage. And when he does, only music can calm him. So he asks for a musician. Somebody says, I know of one in Bethlehem, Jesse's son. Jesse has a son who's an excellent musician. So they call for David. David arrives, and look at what they say about him in verse 18. One of Jesse's sons from Bethlehem is a talented harp player. Not only that, he's a brave warrior, a man of war, has good judgment, and he's a fine-looking young man. The Lord's with him. David comes, he begins to play for Saul, and the Lord calms Saul when David plays. Now, in chapter 17, Saul goes out to war. He no longer needs David's services. So he sends David home. You'll remember the story of David and Goliath, how Goliath would come out and ask that the best warrior of Israel come out and face him 1-to-1 battle, winner take all. Of course, nobody wanted to do it. David is sent to his brothers who are in Saul's army to bring them cheese. So when he gets there, David hears Goliath, and he says, why do you just let Goliath get away with this? God can deliver him. Nobody still goes out, so David says, well, I'll go out. Now, in chapter 17, you may have noticed in verse 55, Saul, watching David go out to fight the Philistine, asks Abner, the general of his army, whose son is this young man? Now, there are two ways of looking at that. Saul might be asking about Jesse, David's father. He may have recognized David. Personally, I don't think that's it. I think some time has passed, 3 or 4 years has passed that Saul has been fighting this war. In the meantime, David grew up. If you remember the story when David says, I'll go fight him, Saul puts his armor on David. Now, usually we think, well, the armor was too big. Saul is such a tall man, head and shoulders above everybody else. Two things about that, though. One is, why would Saul have given David his armor if he recognized that the armor simply didn't fit? And 2, when David tries the armor on, he turns it down. In verse 39, he says, I can't go in this armor. I'm not used to it. The problem was not the size of the armor. The problem was that David was used to fighting the lion and the bear, anything that would come up against the sheep, simply using the Lord. My point is, David was big. He was a tall young man. Saul might have outweighed him, but probably not by much. David has grown up quite a bit, and Saul, I think, doesn't recognize David. He finds out later that David is the same young man that played harp in his court. Well, you know the story how David kills Goliath. The Israelites rout the Philistines. Chapter 18, verse 1. After David had finished talking with Saul, he met Jonathan, the king's son. There was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. And from that day on, Saul kept David with him and wouldn't let him return home. David essentially becomes a very important part of Saul's army. But here's where the problem starts to take place. Saul becomes jealous of David. They begin to sing, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. This is simple Hebrew poetry. In Hebrew poetry, when you have numbers in successive lines, you add 1 to the previous number. For 3 sins of Ammon and for 4. Or Samuel says, 7 things I have noticed, 6 things I've noticed. Yea, 7 stand out to me. Well, in this case, Saul has killed his thousands, and the one that you add is 10. David is tens of thousands. The ones who sang this song gave Saul first mention. I honestly think that if they would have said David has killed his thousands and Saul is 10,000s, Saul would have said, well, they mentioned David first. That's not right. The point is, Saul becomes jealous of David, and he now starts to try to kill David. That's how chapter 18 ends. There is open animosity from Saul toward David. He actually tries to kill David by saying, hey, I'll give you my daughter, but go out and bring me 100 Philistine foreskins, thinking that the Philistines would kill him. Well, David actually brings him 200 foreskins. Now, we started out with the question, what is it that God looks for? God looks for not outward appearances. Chapter 16, verse 7, the Lord says flat out to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or height. I've rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearances, but the Lord looks at the heart. So what was it about the heart of David? First of all, David was a talented harp player. He learned to harp by writing psalms, singing praises to God. Second thing that we notice, chapter 16, verse 18, David's good judgment. He has good judgment. In chapter 17, we see the way he and Jonathan bond together. That's actually chapter 18, isn't it? In chapter 17, we see David's bravery as he goes to confront Goliath. Yeah, there's good reason why the Lord said to Samuel, this is the one, anoint David. I look at his heart. How's your heart today? Like, follow, and subscribe to this devotional on whatever platform you use to listen to it. Email your questions to us at questions@becomehope.com. Tomorrow, we'll answer the question, why did Jonathan help David?